All right. Well, first of all, since there's no microphone, if I could ask the people in the back, if I start to get a little bit difficult to hear, just go like this really prominently, and I'll talk louder. Is this all right, though? Everybody's hearing everything? All right. Well, it's really a real pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to do this. I got a couple friends here. We all taught at Grand Valley State University together. That's where a lot of us had our first jobs many years ago. So I was really excited to come back here to West Michigan. I am currently a professor of history at Rutgers University, the chair of the history department there. And my friends Leo and Paul said, how did lest we forget get in touch with you? I said, I have no idea. An email popped up in my box. Larry Wozniak didn't sound like he was too insane. And I figured, all right, let's do it. Let's go back and do this thing. I don't know much more to really tell you. I've written a couple books. I did a Ph.D. a long time ago, and I do this kind of thing for a living. So I'm glad to be here with you all tonight. What I'm going to do is talk about, really sort of build to talking about the policies of 1774 called the Coercive Acts. That was the name that Great Britain gave them. So they weren't hiding that these were meant to be really tough acts. The British called them coercive. The Americans called them the Intolerable Acts, which maybe you've heard of that name more, the same set of acts. They were passed in 1774, and what I'm going to try to convince you of tonight that was really the point of no return. In 1774, with the passage of the Coercive Acts, something like a Declaration of Independence became inevitable. So what I want to do, and I'm going to have to step back and go back a pretty long way to even get back to those Coercive Acts, is to convince you of something that a lot of people don't really like to accept initially. None of my students want to buy this when they enter my classrooms, the American Revolution. Perhaps some of you don't tonight. But if I'm saying that the point of no return, the inevitable point where there could no longer be any kind of alliance with the British wasn't until 1774, what I'm suggesting is that we don't have a story of a long, slow burn. We don't have a story of Americans in the 13 colonies slowly and surely, inevitably, inexorably, over a long period of time concluding we can no longer be British. In fact, this was an insight, I'll argue, that came very late in the day, and that a number of other avenues were possible. And then we'll talk about why it is that we got to this point in 1774 where that was no longer possible. But the only way, I think, to understand the true power of the American Revolution, the true way in which it was a tremendously disruptive and genuinely revolutionary experience, is to realize that the men and women, both who lived through it and fought it, spent most of their adult lives not expecting to be revolutionaries. And I'll talk about how and why that expectation was shattered, and why in the Coercive Acts that insight, that understanding came to be inescapable and unavoidable. Now, you all do, in fact, have a pencil and paper. I assure you there will not be a quiz. These two guys, I'll quiz these guys on the ride back, see what they picked up from it. Although apparently it is going to be on YouTube. So anything you didn't get tonight, you can go back and revisit, and I expect you to do that carefully. But there will come a time during the lecture where we've gone through what I'll acknowledge is some fairly complex and sophisticated political thought and political ideology, which might be a little overwhelming, and then what we're going to do is we're going to graph it. And everybody's going to graph it together on their pencil and paper. But it turns out there's a whiteboard, and it also turns out, Leo, that I stole a marker at NEIU today, your place where you work, thinking there might be one. So actually this is going to be very low stakes because I'm going to graph it right along with you on the whiteboard. And what you'll be able to do is then understand, through a visual, the three great crises that broke up the British Empire. The Sugar and Stamp Act crisis of 1764-65, the Townshend Acts crisis of 1767 through 1770, and then our Coercive Acts crisis, which will be the big grandfather crisis of them all. And so all this complex stuff we've either been talking about and you've been thinking about, we'll actually be able to visualize it on your paper, on your board, and you'll do it with me together. And I have a feeling that you're going to understand it far better than the Rutgers students I teach, who sometimes get it and sometimes don't. So that's what we're going to do tonight. Hope the volume's still good. Just let me know when it isn't. In order to address this question of why the Coercive Acts are a point of no return, and why that point of return actually happens very late, 1774, and the true insight that this is where they're at really doesn't come until the Second Continental Congress of 1775, we have to actually do is go back in time. and look at the world of the British Empire that the people living in the 13 North American mainland colonies were part of. Now, we all know, and if we didn't before, this year we've been reminded again and again and again, that the United States was born in war and revolution. However, the 18th century British Empire that they lived in had also been born in war and revolution, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And in many ways, the generation that fought the American Revolution were the inheritors of what we call a long 18th century. An 18th century that began in 1688 with the transformation of British political culture and the very nature of the British monarchy, and which ushered in a cycle of warfare between Britain and France, with some proxy allies along the way, that didn't really stop until 1815 with the final defeat of Napoleon. And that's why historians call the 18th century the long 18th century. We see it as really the coherent period of time in which a certain set of questions are asked and then definitively answered at the Battle of Waterloo, begins in 1688 and ends in 1815 with the unequivocal triumph of Great Britain and the foundation then being laid for it to be the global power for the next century. However, a lot of that foundation achieves a lot of power too in the 18th century, and North Americans are very much a part of it. So I want to talk a little bit about what it meant to be a British imperial subject of the king living in North America over the period of this long 18th century, and the kinds of questions and challenges, but also possibilities and opportunities that created for people. Because that's the world that the generation that became the American Revolutionary generation inherited, and that's the lens through which they thought about and tried to understand the challenges they were facing in their early to mid-adulthood as they came of age in the 1760s and 1770s. Okay? Ready with me? All right, so let's do that. So, when the British, English really, they become British officially in 1707, when the English overthrew their Stuart king James II in 1688, they in fact transformed what monarchy meant in the English-speaking world. And the English in that glorious revolution created a new form of monarchy that didn't exist anywhere else. Didn't exist in France, didn't exist in Spain, and hadn't existed in England. You can miss it because there's still a king. And we think, oh, well, they all have kings. But in fact, the king in the English tradition after 1688 is a different kind of monarchy. It's what we call a limited constitutional monarchy. Because what they did in 1688 was finally once and for all establish in law that kings were in fact not the givers of law, but underneath the authority of law. And in that revolution in 1688, they parceled out different responsibilities and powers into different places. And particularly what they did was, for the first time, they unequivocally took away the power of the king to tax directly and to oversee revenue in the English state. And they, rather than have it just be a custom or a tradition or something you'd like to have or a wish, unequivocally placed into law that the power to tax and the power to control money would sit within the British Parliament. Okay? Now, this had always been an aspiration for some in English history, and some crafty common lawyers even invented a tradition that had once existed that way back in the mists of time before the horrible Norman conquest. But I'm here to tell you today that was a lie. It hadn't. England had been genuinely an absolutist monarchy, just like France, and that came to an end in the Glorious Revolution, where kings were placed firmly under law with an expectation that they would have to follow authority and rule of law, and the power of money would not be under the authority of kings. Now, I say it's under the authority of Parliament, but even that isn't the full extent of the revolution. Because why would you take the power to tax away from the king? Why would you do that? Actually, why would you do that? Why would you want to take the power to tax away from a king? The power to tax your property and take a portion of it.
When king decides to try and tax the rich.
Or anybody.
Stuff his own pockets.
Okay, right. So the fact is that in an absolutist monarchical understanding of political culture, the king is the state. Famously, Louis XIV says, "L'état c'est moi." I am the state. And that makes sense. The state receives taxes. We all know this, right? We pay our taxes. Maybe some don't. Most of us should pay our taxes. We're supposed to pay our taxes every year. And the understanding, now we may argue about how much we should pay or where we should go, but just about everybody in this room, I think, would agree that we all do have certain broad priorities for our nation that are larger than our own. and it's not reasonable for, say, whoever gets elected president to pay for that himself, that we all should collectively participate and contribute to what we think of as the public good. Now, we may argue vociferously about how to understand or define that public good, but as Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, taxation is the price we pay for civilization. And the English understand this too, and if they don't, it's also very acute for them, because being a Protestant nation and having overthrown an absolutist monarch who'd been loyal to the French and an ally of the French absolutist state wants to overturn this glorious revolution, and immediately goes to war with England, and in fact is the major power of Europe in the 17th and early 18th centuries. And so it's very clear what the common good is. Protect yourself from what you understand as an Englishman to be the evil, horrible, popish, Catholic, tyrannical, absolutist French monarchy. That is actually something worth paying some taxes for. On the other hand, you also have to understand that taxation is an awesome power, a tremendous power. That same Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said the power to tax is the power to destroy. In theory, a state that taxes at an onerous or extreme level could tax away all of a subject or a citizen's property to the point where they no longer had the independent authority to control their own fate and their own will. So at the same time as Englishmen and women in the 17th and early 18th centuries understand that the power to tax is necessary, you're not going to build the navies and the armies to defend yourself from the awful French unless you do it. Granting the state the power to tax is also dangerous. The state could misuse or abuse that power. It could become a cure worse than the disease. And so what the English finally enshrine in law in their glorious revolution is that the king will still receive taxes, but will not be able to determine the rate, the method, or the collection of taxation. And that in fact, that process will be connected to a phrase you've all heard, the Americans don't invent it, taxation connected to representation. Which means that taxation doesn't just exist in Parliament. Parliament, as I'm sure you all know, consists of two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords sit by hereditary right. If you've read your Jane Austen, you know there's lots of earls and dukes running around. They all get to sit in the House of Lords. The eldest son inherits the title, and he gets to sit in the House of Lords as well. The House of Commons, then, they're not really very common, but they are elected folk who represent the tax-paying, property-owning figures of England, which is not all that many, but still, it's, for the 18th century, not so bad. Pretty representative as these things go. And believe it or not, as a result of the Glorious Revolution, the power to tax is placed solely in the House of Commons. The House of Lords also is not given the authority to determine the rate or the process or the method of taxation. There's a faint afterglow of that. To this day, you probably know that all taxation bills must originate not in our Senate, but in our lower house, our House of Representatives. And that's the reason why. The idea that the house that's closest to the people should be the one determining, that's largest, that's most recent, that's most frequently elected, should be the one actually determining the process of how the people pay taxes. So how exactly does taxation with representation work? Well, what the English say is it works when two things are true. First, those who are determining the taxation must be elected by the taxpayers. All right? And second, those who are determining the taxation must pay the same taxes they're requiring other people to pay. What the English say is that means that there is taxation connected to representation, which means the power to tax will not infringe upon or endanger the right of property. For a very practical reason. If you are elected by those who are paying the taxes and they become unhappy with how you are abusing the power, they can unelect you. They can vote you out at the next election. Double check is that if you are taxing the people at a level that is onerous or unacceptable or unfair, you also have to pay those taxes, you the member of the House of Commons, and you're injuring yourself too. And so what the English say is, if long as those two things are true, those who are determining the taxation are elected by the taxpayers, and those who are determining the taxation have to pay the same taxes that other people pay, we can entrust the power of taxation to the state while believing that will not lead to the abuse of our rights of property, which we can't ever believe an absolutist monarch would respect. Why? Well, the absolutist monarch is the state. By definition, the king doesn't pay taxes. He receives taxes. So he has no incentive to lower the levels. He also, obviously, you can't vote out a king. Right? So he doesn't meet either of the two requirements. But neither does the House of Lords. Now, the House of Lords, unlike nobles in France, they do pay taxes. But as I've just suggested, they are not elected. You can't vote the Lords out. You don't get to vote out the Duke of Gloucester. He's the Duke, and his son's going to be the Duke after him. Nothing you can do about it. Only the House of Commons meets these requirements, and so this awesome authority and power to tax is placed solely with common, again, they're not, by common I don't mean average. I mean, people who get elected to the House of Commons and own land in England are gentry and they're wealthy and they're powerful. But nevertheless, they are genuinely representative of the people who do most of the land owning and most of the tax paying in England. And that, for, say, 1688, isn't too shabby. That is not something that exists in any other nation in Europe at the time, and won't for the rest of the 18th century. With the exception of the crazy Dutch Republic, but we'll forget about that. But certainly not the major powers of the 18th century, France, Spain, and England, who are really going to contend for authority and power in Europe and in North America. England is unique. England and then Britain, when it formally aligns with Scotland and becomes Britain in 1707, is unique. Okay. Well, that's all interesting. Well, why? Who cares? What does it matter? Well, it turns out that if you have done something audacious like discredit absolutist monarchy, angering Louis XIV, the great, powerful absolutist monarch of France, therefore making it very, very likely that you're going to be part of a large cycle of expensive and dangerous wars, as I've suggested they were, being able to assemble a lot of money is a really good thing. You need a lot of money to pay for these wars. And it turns out that limited constitutional monarchies, in which the taxpayers have confidence that they are genuinely represented by those taxing them, and have a genuine participatory role to play in determining how they'll be taxed and what that taxation will be used for, turn out to be much more legitimate and credible taxing states than their competitors. It's actually rather risky to allow Louis XIV to tax you. You can't control the process. You have to worry about what he will do. He is the state. He determines the taxation rates. He determines what he taxes. He determines how he taxes. People, if you can, will try to maybe hide some of your money. Maybe soak up your money in conspicuous consumption by building lavish estates so you have less to be taxed. It turns out that you're much, much more comfortable being taxed by a state where you are genuinely represented. Right off the bat, then, in the 1690s, as these wars begin, the English start taxing at record levels. It turns out that the English state, prior to this absolutist monarchy that existed before 1688, a lot of people were hiding their taxes, were trying to get away, get it taxed as little as possible. This new, much more legitimate state, fighting a war for the religion you care about and the liberties that you cherish, is one people will pay taxes to. However, just to give you a sense of what the English are up against in 1688, in that year when these wars began, England had a population of around 5 million people. France had a population of around 20 million. And if you've ever looked at a map, I know that one of our members, where is he? Where's our treasurer? Is a European traveler, and he can attest that France, while it has about 4 times the size and population, also has about 4 times the landmass of England.
Takes 9 hours to drive across.
Yeah, much bigger. And so, by the balance sheet of the materiel for war, people, landmass, natural resources, taxation base, all the advantages are for France. There's a reason why we think of Louis XIV and Versailles as the archetype of European monarchy and the glory of sort of the European state in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. We don't think of England. Very quickly, up against such a juggernaut, it turns out that even being able to tax at record levels, much higher, 3-4 times as much as the English state had taxed before, it's not enough to pay for the wars. And what the English state begins to do is it begins to, not the first, I don't want to exaggerate, it's not the first to invent it, but it does it at such a vaster and more larger and more systematic and permanent scale that it may as well be the first. It creates what we think of as public debt and deficit spending. And what the English begin to realize is that if you can tax more effectively and efficiently, as I've explained they can, it means you can borrow much more extensively. Because when you're borrowing, what you're asking the taxpayers to do is go beyond the taxes you've required of them and voluntarily lend you their money. Why would anybody do that? Well, what the English state says, if you lend us your money, we will promise to enter into a relationship with you, a contractual relationship with you, where we will pay interest promised on the debt you've lent until such time as we pay you back. And where does the interest come from? It comes from the taxation that they can collect so effectively. So the more you can effectively tax, and the more you can promise to pay interest on your debt, called servicing your debt, the more money you can borrow up front to be able to pay for some expensive project like, say, defending the nation at war, and be able to defray the cost down the road. So if you're a better taxing state, you become a better borrowing state. And while England may be smaller, it may initially have a smaller economy, it can tap into that economy much deeper into the social order, much, much more effectively than the French state can. Now, part of that is because it's much, much less risky to lend to a state that is under law, that is part of a certifiable contract, where the people you're lending to are actually accountable to you through election in the way they're not to the French state. So a taxing state is better if it has a representative legislature overseeing it, and therefore that state is a better borrowing state as well. And so what happens very quickly is the English can actually mobilize resources much more effectively than the French can. That's why they can build such a large navy very, very quickly. We've all heard of this massive, wonderful British Navy that really does control the seas in the 18th and 19th centuries. It comes from being able to raise that revenue. You can measure this, and then we'll move on quickly, but one thing is interesting, you can measure this in something as what's seemingly as dull as interest rates. So if you are lending to the French state, you're taking a risk, because what you're lending to is Louis XIV, a man who is not accountable at law and whom you cannot hold the contract. And that means that if Louis XIV decides to renege on his promises, simply cancel his debts, you can't sue Louis XIV, you can't punish Louis XIV, you can't hold Louis XIV accountable. Which means that if you are going to lend to him, you try to hedge your risk by demanding exorbitant interest rates up front when he really needs the money, assuming that over time he'll simply back out on his promises to you. And so if you measure the interest rates that France has to pay in order to borrow, when it borrows domestically from its own French subject, it's paying about 8% interest a year. And when it borrows from the Dutch and Italian money markets, it's being assessed about 15 to 20% a year. Why the difference? Well, that's the difference of an absolute estate. French subjects have no choice but to accept a lower interest rate. You really measure the confidence in the state by the people who lend to it who are not subject to its authority. And what the Dutch and Italian bankers are saying is, we need to jack as much interest out of this guy as we can, as quickly as we can, because we know he'll screw us in the end. He will not keep his promises. Over the course of that same period during which these wars are being fought, between 1688 and the 1760s, which is where we'll look at the Coercive Acts, in 1688, this new raw experiment in England of limited constitutional monarchy is also having to promise 8% interest a year. But by 1750, it's paying 3% interest a year. So where Louis is having to provide 8% interest on what he borrows domestically, and sometimes as much as 15 to 20% in the foreign money markets, the English are paying only 3% to both foreign and domestic lenders. Everybody respects and trusts the English debt. It's the most safe and reliable investment you can make in the 18th century. In fact, the English don't just begin to borrow from their own subjects. The Dutch want to lend to them. The Italians want to lend to them. The big secret is a lot of French aristocrats, very carefully, circuitously through Italian banks, also lend to the English because it's such a reliable source of income. In a world where there's not a lot of insurance and investments are risky, here's one that's not. And so the English public debt, which goes to about £1 million in 1694, by 1763 is 140 million pounds. So it goes from 1.2 million in 1694 to 140 million by 1763, the end of the 7 years of French and Indian War. And yet during that period of time, the interest the English have to pay on that debt falls from 8 to 3%. That's a recipe for absolute confidence in a state. People are saying, we want to lend to you. In fact, by the 1720s, the English simply stop saying they'll pay back the debt. They start issuing what they call irredeemable debt, saying, lend to us, we're never going to pay you back, but in perpetuity we'll pay you interest, and you'll have lifetime income, which is your real property, your real estate you can then bequeath to your children after you until the end of time. And people still buy the debt. They want to be in business with the English state. Okay. You follow that? Okay. The English then exist at the heart of an 18th century which is unprecedented in its transformative development. Now let me step back and admit that we historians understand the limits of the data. It's hard enough to get a handle on the economy right now, what's really going on. Further back in time you go, the sources are exiguous, there's not a lot of them, but there's more than you might think. And if you want to, take this down, there's a website called Our World in Data, Our World in Data. It's down out of Cambridge University, where they have done a wonderful job of recreating the global economy from the ancient Sumerians to today. And as best as we can tell, global output between 1600 and 1700, the capacity of the human peoples of the globe to produce over the course of the 17th century, between 16 and 1700, grew by 12% in that century. During this long 18th century that we're talking about, global output increased by 90%. So they created in that period almost another entire global economy beyond what their grandparents and parents had known. During that same period of time, the English economy grew by 200%. So they created another two economies. They were at the heart of this, and a lot of it was being driven by the capacity of the state to mobilize vast amounts of resources through taxing and borrowing, so as immediately to spend that money on the material of war. So the state is a huge aggregator, bringing together lots and lots and lots of money and then spending it immediately. Who are they spending it on? They're issuing private contracts to shipbuilders, to the men who build armaments, to those who construct uniforms, to the vast numbers of people who are actually being brought into these armies and navies. And what this has is a tremendous ancillary or connected effect. As more and more of this money is being mobilized and spent, what this also leads to is more and more people getting access to new forms of income they hadn't had before. Now, by 1740, 2 out of 5 English people, 40% of the population, had income each year double required for subsistence. Think about that. 40% of the English population had an income by the mid-18th century, double that required for subsistence. We call that disposable income. This at a time where in France, and I'm going to admit, this is one of those statistics you kind of make up, but I've been doing this a long time and it's a pretty educated guess. I would guess maybe between 3 to 5% of the French population would have an income of double subsistence. That's, in England, what we call a middle class of consumers, of spenders. And that creates its own private economy of consumption, of production, of desires to buy things that is not directly connected to the state spending, but is the result of that state spending. It's connected to it. So you have private and public combining together to create a kind of economy in society that simply doesn't exist anywhere else. And this solidifies within the English sensibility what I would call a certain kind of arrogant smugness about their own superiority. What they would say is that England or Britain stands for liberty, prosperity, and Protestantism. And it stands fighting war against its archenemy France, which exists to spread tyranny, poverty, and popery, or Catholicism. If you've ever seen Hogarth Prince, the great artist of the 18th century, the Englishman is John Bull, this ruddy-faced, big, large-bellied fellow. Looks a little like me. He eats roast beef. He has a sturdy bulldog next to him. He stands astride the 18th century as a colossus. The French, the only well-fed people in Hogarth Prince in France are monks and priests. They're eating up. Well, there's a wonderful one called Calais Gate. Calais is the last English enclave that they control in France, and you're looking through the Calais Gate at this lascivious, lustful French priest who's holding this huge side of beef, and all the Frenchmen around him are these emaciated figures with ribs sticking out. If you look down in the corner, there's a guy dressed in tartan. And you know that therefore that's how you can judge that this is a post-1745 print, because that's obviously, that's obviously from a Highland Scot from the Battle of Culloden who got his lunch handed to him and had to fly to France, and he's now living on the streets. Right? No question here. In fact, the English add a little. They say no popery, no tyranny, no poverty, no wooden shoes. Right? Well, the English get to wear comfortable leather shoes, while the French have to wear the old-fashioned, uncomfortable wooden shoes. But there's no comparison to the English. We have liberty, we have limited constitutional monarchy, we have power, we have wealth. Who wouldn't want to be part of this sort of society? There's no choice to be made here. What I want to suggest is that English people living in North America largely agree with them. One of the things that this British state does, this taxing and borrowing state, what one historian calls a fiscal military state. It's a state that exists to tax, so as to borrow, so as to fight war, so as to expand its tax base, so it can do more taxing and more borrowing and fight more and larger and more effective wars. This fiscal military state actually is therefore capable of creating the kind of state power that can project its will outward, police oceans, build a large navy, and create a coherent empire. But it turns out that actually being part of that empire, a place where you have a huge growing population with 40% disposable income, with an insatiable need for the raw materials you have in North America, being part of that empire is actually a pretty good deal. You want to be able to get access to this large market. You want to be able to trade with this large this large entity that exists to spend and spread money around. Right? And so what the English do in the 18th century is, for the first time, they're able to start enforcing acts of will and law that had existed in the 17th century but had been largely ignored in the colonies. The most famous of these, and I'm sure most of you have heard of them, are called the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts broadly, I won't go into all the details, essentially what they say is if you are a subject of the British king, you should not be doing things that will assist the horrible French. You shouldn't be selling to the French, you shouldn't be trading with the French, you shouldn't be using ships built by the French, you should not be enriching the French, you should be enriching the British Empire so that we can combine together to defeat this horrible enemy. Now what we think, well, wouldn't that be frustrating to the North American colonists? After all, if you know your map, Canada's French, it's right there, the French West Indies and all this. Why wouldn't you want to trade with the French? That's not the way they look at it. What they realize is what the Navigation Acts are doing is drawing a very firm line around the largest market in the world, policed by the Navy, and saying all of the competitor colonies of France and Spain don't get to trade with this large market. French Canadians also have large wood stores for ships. They also produce grain. There are plenty of raw materials in the Spanish West Indies. What the British are saying is not only can you not trade with France and Spain, we can't trade with those French and Spanish colonies. We trade with the North American colonies. We enrich each other together. And the Navigation Acts, in fact, become a way to separate out who gets to be part of this large, growing, desirable market and who doesn't. It's a privilege to be under them. And in fact, the Navigation Acts are so popular in North America that they begin to construct an ideological sense that North Americans have of what the empire is, how they fit in it, and what their relationship is to Parliament. So before I go on, I tend to throw a lot at people. It can sound a little overwhelming at times. My students tell me this. So what questions might you have before we continue? Because we're going to build on what we've learned so far. And I'll take a drink of water.
Where did Napoleon come in on this picture?
Napoleon he's not even born yet. He's just an exciting little teaser about the end of the, we'll never hear from him tonight again.
He became a big shot.
He becomes a big shot later, but that's early 19th century. We will not be dealing with him. Little man, big shot. Right. But any questions about what we've talked about? Yeah.
How do the British feel about the Dutch?
That's a very interesting question. Prior to the Glorious Revolution, the English kings are absolutely aligned with the French. You may know that Louis XIV in the late 17th century is putting punishing warfare on the Dutch Republic. Largely, it's the source of its 18th century decline. As soon as the Glorious Revolution happens, that flips over. You may know that the king, the man married to the heir to the throne after they deposed James, who's his daughter Mary, is married to William of Orange, who was the military leader of the Dutch Republic. He becomes the king of England. And the English and the Dutch become firm allies in the late 17th and 18th century after the Glorious Revolution, and remain close allies. They're both Protestant nations. Neither of them are absolutist monarchies. The Dutch are actually a republic. You may be interested to know the United States in 1776 is not the only republic in the world. The Dutch are a republic and have been since the 1670s. But the Dutch and the English in the 18th century become allies. And it's also helpful that the Dutch are kind of in decline and the English are replacing them as the premier commercial power of the Atlantic world. And so they don't have any more, so they have less frustration with them they had in the 17th century. Much better relations in our period than before. You, and then you.
When the Glorious Revolution happened, did the British want something so different? Because they just took a left turn and went over to this different way. And was it because they wanted to be different from the French?
That's an excellent.
They saw the
Yeah.
economic benefit.
No, and that's an excellent question. In fact, when I was talking to my students, I divide the Glorious Revolution up into what I call the intended and the unintended consequences. And much of this world of fiscal military states they've been talking about, unexpected, unforeseen. It turns out that's true. Now, they figured it out pretty quickly. They invent the Bank of England in 1694. By the way, the Bank of England is co-directed by two men named John Locke and Isaac Newton, so that's pretty impressive. They're running the mint and running the bank. They get smart guys in there. But no, that don't foresee. But in the interest of time, I kind of didn't tell you that the 17th century is a century of great conflict and contestation in England. And all of these ideas that finally are enshrined in the Glorious Revolution have been knocking about the place, really for most, even actually going back to Elizabeth in the late 16th century, but certainly the 17th century is a century of contestation and conflict. In the mid-17th century, they actually kill a king and have a republic for 11 years. So there's all kinds of conflict in England over these ideas about broadly what we call divine right theory versus, say, contract and law theory. It's just that for the 17th century, for the most part, England is going the direction of France. It's sort of a junior partner. And its divine right, absolutist monarchical mainstream is being more and more solidified. That is overthrown in the Glorious Revolution. And then they build on this and go in this new and radical direction, which becomes very quickly legitimated because they start suddenly realizing they can raise a lot more money, win a lot of these wars, and make this kind of unthinkable to go back. You got it. Excellent. There was another question, I think. Yeah.
I got a problem.
Okay.
Great lecture.
Oh, it's not even started. It's going to get way better.
My mind keeps taking me into the current situations of our own government. End of discussion. You can continue.
Sure. I see what you're saying. Yeah, so what I guess I want to suggest, right. I mean, I guess he's talking about the current situation, and a lot of people were, in fact, I just saw some, I think our debt service has become a larger part of GDP than ever before. What I want to suggest is that there's no simple answers there. I think what a lot of people who worry about kind of the way in which they might think that we're a profligate state today might think that there's only one way to think about debt. What I'm suggesting is actually no, I mean, there's another way to think about it. Now, what I will say is there's huge debate in England in the 18th century of the sort we're having. And let me be blunt, now again, you think whatever you want, I'd say the people who screw up the empire and provoke the American Revolution are the ones who think that there's too much debt. The ones who think we haven't even scratched the surface of what we could be doing are the ones who are constantly on the side of the Americans in these conflicts. Take that for what it's worth. And I'll talk a little bit about what that could do during the 7 Years' War in a moment. William Pitt is a debt man. They love William Pitt. A guy you've never heard of called the Marquis of Rockingham, even more a debt man. I am convinced, I'm writing a book now, this isn't really the argument, but I have no doubt that if Rockingham had remained in power, he's the guy who solves the Stamp Act crisis. He then falls out of power for reasons that have nothing to do with North America. I'm convinced that if he'd been given 10 years, we certainly wouldn't have had an American Revolution at the time we did. There are some really, really thoughtful, careful people on both sides of the ocean who really have a lot invested in maintaining this empire. No one more so than Benjamin Franklin, who spends decades of his life working to keep the empire going. His son actually becomes a loyalist, William Franklin. He almost does, and then he doesn't. Although people are a little dubious. Yeah.
Didn't the Dutch also bankroll the revolution?
Yeah, so the Dutch are doing a lot of this, although not on the scale, they just are smaller and they don't have as much domestic production. The English actually end up start taxing a lot of what they're producing within their own nation. The Dutch never have a lot of domestic production to tax. But the English do it on a much, much larger scale. And I would argue that given the huge boost in taxation they're getting from their own English subjects right away, that a lot of what's bankrolling the ability to borrow is taxation revenue coming from within the British Isles. The Dutch largely don't have a lot of money. They've been spending all their money. They've been fighting the French for 20 years by 1688. They're largely tapped out. In fact, the Dutch go into precipitous decline starting in the late 17th century. Their real heyday is the 1630s and 40s.
That Dutch West Indies at that point.
They do have a presence in the West Indies, yeah, but it's largely what they are is sort of they're basically the kind of commercial carriers of the Atlantic world. Most things are going on Dutch ships in the 17th century. After they begin to pass and enforce the Navigation Acts, by the early 18th century, all English goods are being carried on English ships.
Could you please just a little bit elaborate on your navigation acts?
Yes.
That they were popular, like who wrote it, and whose idea was it?
Yeah, so the Navigation Acts are actually, believe it or not, first passed all the way back in 1651. In fact, during that period where they beheaded the king in our republic. And the one thing when the king comes back in 1660, he says, well, actually, those were a good idea. We're going to keep those. We're going to keep that. And so the Navigation Acts are reenacted in 1660 because nothing of the Republic did can ever be legal, so they reenact it. So they've been around. By the time they really begin to matter and be enforced, which I'd say is pretty much kind of after 1710, they've actually been on the books for a good long time. It's just that during the 17th century, England is in a state of chaos. It's fighting lots of civil wars. It doesn't have this major, powerful taxing and borrowing state. It doesn't have the capacity to enforce these acts. What starts to happen after 1715 is that the Navy becomes what we know it to be, and you can actually begin to enforce and police an Atlantic Ocean empire. But that coincides with the rise of this powerful, consuming middle-class world of wealth, this unprecedented amount of wealth, where there's a huge market for the goods they're demanding the Americans only sell to them. They're demanding at a time where they've never wanted to buy more and more of those goods. And so what the Navigation Acts become is, in a sense, what we might call a tariff law, although I don't really want to put it that way. What they become is a legal way of preventing other competitor European colonies and nations from getting access to a British imperial market. So if you're on the inside of that, if you're legal within the Navigation Acts as a British subject, you can in fact sell the wares you have, the materials of North America, to the largest market in the world, free of competition from French and Spanish colonial competitors. And so what you start to see in this, all the world we know of colonial America, the great houses of Virginia, I live in Philadelphia, the beautiful houses if you've ever been to Center City and down to Old City, all of that is built in the 1730s and 1740s. It doesn't exist before that. People are living far less lavish and impressive lives, much, much poorer lives, both in Britain and America. The key to see here is that this world of this British dominating 18th century is beginning to develop at the same time in the 1730s and 40s on both sides of the oceans. And what it does is it gives life to this new idea of the Briton, right? And only English people can be English. But after the Act of Union in 1707, this idea of the Briton, what the Briton becomes is a person who's part of this large, wealthy, Protestant imperial world. And you don't have to be English to be British. Two of the most impressive intellectual figures of the British 18th century, Adam Smith and David Hume, are Scottish. They're not English. The key is that you can be British in Philadelphia too. Benjamin Franklin is a British gentleman. A wonderful biography by a wonderful historian, Gordon Wood, about Benjamin Franklin talks about the way in which he develops as a British figure and a British gentleman in the 1730s and 40s as he begins to model himself over the possibilities that this new world is creating for people, this new world of wealth and prosperity, solidified, they're convinced, by their superior Protestant faith. And the Navigation Acts are a crucial part of that. So, what the Navigation Acts do for the Americans, check the time, the Navigation Acts do for the Americans is they begin, the American colonists, these British North American colonists, is they become the bedrock of a developing consciousness of what it means to be a British imperial subject of the king who happens to live 3,000 miles in an ocean away. Because that's still a big deal. I mean, it takes a long time for us to fly across the Atlantic. You can imagine, we're talking at minimum 6 weeks just to hear news, right? Clearly, if you're a British subject of the king living in Philadelphia, that's not the same as living in London, or even living in Glasgow. You're further away, you're distant, that matters. Things are difficult. It's not as easy to be in constant contact, and it's not as easy to be connected. But what connects them is the world of wealth and commerce, tangibly understood by the Navigation Acts. That's the single biggest connection. You're trading all the time. More and more ships are coming. Those ships bring goods back and forth in both directions, but they also bring news, they bring public prints, they bring the same lavish mahogany tables and the great mirrors that are now in the big houses. Everybody begins to consume the same kinds of things. They begin to read the same kind of printed matter. And that's the way a sense of an imperial subjecthood and connection can develop. People having the same common experiences and living in the same, more and more increasingly integrated British imperial world. And what that develops for the Americans, they combine that experience with also what they are absolutely convinced of, their same identical British liberties coming out of the Glorious Revolution. The core of them being, as we've already learned, taxation connected to representation, to begin to define for themselves exactly how they exist in the empire and what that means the British state, and particularly Parliament, can and should do to govern them, but also what it shouldn't do. And what they distinguish between again and again and again, and they can do this by the 1740s and 1750s, is they distinguish between, they describe as the state's power of legislation and the state's power of taxation. And they see these things as distinct. What does that mean? Well, taxation is what we've talked about, the state's power to go and claim a portion of your property and take it for its own purposes. And we've already seen that if you're a British subject, what you must have for your British liberty is taxation connected to representation, which if you're living in the British Isles means that the only legitimate body that can tax you is the House of Commons. The King can't do it, the House of Lords can't do it, we all understand that. But there's a complexity with that 3,000 miles and the ocean, because it's simply not practical or possible or feasible for the North American population to be adequately represented in that House of Commons. By the 1740s and 50s, it's already a third the population of England. That's how fast it's growing. You can't swell the House of Commons by a third. The expense of sending those people over would be more than the tax. It's just not feasible and practical and possible. And so a lot of North Americans spend a lot of time thinking about, well, how will we get those British liberties? Clearly, in England, they're protected. In Britain, they're protected when the House of Commons does the taxing. But the House of Commons can't be representative of us in the same way it's representative of Britons living in the British Isles. Therefore, thankfully, all the way back since 1618 with the first colony in Virginia, it's nice that every one of our colonies has established a tradition that we have our own colonial legislatures. Because clearly they would meet the requirement of taxation connected to representation. If I live in Pennsylvania and I'm a tax-paying landowner and I help to elect my Pennsylvania legislature, I am electing it, those legislators pay the same taxes I pay, the Pennsylvania legislature does represent me and is a legitimate taxing body. It would be as un-British and a violation of my liberties for Parliament, the Commons, to tax me, living in Pennsylvania, as it would be for the legislature of Virginia to tax me. Parliament shouldn't do it. Not because I'm not British, not because I think of myself as distinct from the British, but because I am British. And I deserve the same British liberties as any Briton living anywhere. And that's what it means to be Briton. It doesn't mean English, it means British. Scots are British, English are British, the Anglo-Protestant Irish are British, and we in North America are British, which means we all deserve representation connected to taxation. It just is that every other place I've named is close enough to have representation in Parliament. The Scots actually ended their Parliament with the Act of Union and started sending Scots to the House of Commons, but we in North America can't do that. So clearly, because we're British and have British liberty, Parliament must never tax us. However, what Parliament can do and should do and must do, because the French are out there and they're dangerous and they'll never stop, and we in North America know that because they're not 3,000 miles in an ocean away. If you're living in Massachusetts, they're a day's march in Canada, and they will join with native allies, and the French state will try to overthrow us everywhere it can. What the British state must do, and Parliament must do, is coordinate this empire, this wonderful Protestant empire of wealth and liberty, to as much as it can defend every part of the empire through the regulation of all of our behavior for the public good of the empire. And so with that we call legislation, say the colonists. Legislation is all that power and acts of government, acts of laws that do everything other than take away a portion of our property through taxation. Legislation doesn't take our property, legislation regulates our behavior. The Navigation Acts would be a classic example of this. The Navigation Acts are not taking a portion of a subject's property. What they're saying is, when you go to sell, don't trade with the enemy. That's forbidden. Trade within the British Empire. Act in accordance with the public good of the British Empire. Whereas a tax would take a portion of your property for the sake of the financing of the state. So you see the difference? Legislation regulates behavior and directs how good British subjects should act. Taxation is a law a government passes to take a portion of your property legally and lawfully to use for its own purposes. And what the colonists are saying is, we, because we're British, must not be taxed by the House of Commons, but we do need an empire to be regulated and run well. It does need to be run centrally and with authority, and only the British Parliament has the vision to do that. It should legislate for us. The Navigation Acts are therefore acceptable, but if Parliament should ever tax us, that would not be. That would be a violation of our own British liberties. Follow that? Yeah.
How does piracy affect the world economy?
Yeah, so there's a lot of it. There's also a lot of smuggling. And, if we had all the time, we want to talk about that. But what I would say is, then as now, there's lots of, none of us do this. There's a lot of illicit activity going on today, right? Lots of black market activity all over the place. The thing you want to see is that we all talk about how black market privateers and pirates are evil. And actually, they can only exist because there's a huge, powerful licit economy, legal economy. It doesn't make sense to engage in the illegal actions unless you are connected with all of the wealth and power that makes those illegal actions worthwhile. And what you tend to do with your profits, like let's say you secretly trade a little with the French to get some money on the side, what you end up doing is therefore usually buying British manufactured goods and contributing to the wealth of the state anyway. So in many ways, there's very little action that's being happening in North America, whether strictly legal or perhaps technically illegal, that isn't in the end benefiting the wealth and the power of this British state because their navy can largely police the navigation routes. Okay. So here's where the first use of the paper will come in. Because, so take it all out and draw it with me, I'll draw it with you. When I talk about the distinction between taxation and legislation, we can actually demonstrate that pictorially. Again, I'm no artist, it's all very simple, simply by drawing a horizontal dotted line. Okay? And it's dotted because that's meant to represent this distinction in their minds between taxation and legislation. Is that a physical thing that exists in reality? No, this is an ideological distinction they've drawn. They've come to a complex conclusion that legislation is acceptable and taxation is not. So I depict it as dotted because I wanted to suggest that it's more ephemeral and in the world of thought. It's not solid. So if this is the distinction they draw, what we could say is, and just draw it along with me, that we could say that above the line is the world of taxation, and below the line is the world of legislation. And essentially all the colonists are saying is, Parliament has the authority to act upon us and govern our behavior down here. It should not cross this intellectual, ideological distinction we've made and try to tax us up here. Okay? However, and here's the next thing we're drawing, there is another line that matters in the 18th century empire. And it absolutely bisects this line in half. And this you'll draw as a solid line. Because it's not something the colonists imagine in their minds. It's a very physical, hard, real geographic reality. And what the solid line depicts is the coastline of North America. So that's real, that's not dotted. So you can think about your diagram in front of you as a map, north, south, east, west. And so if this is the coastline of North America, out here is the ocean, right? And the world, what we call the external realm, the world outside of North America. And in here, the further west you go, you get into Michigan eventually, right? They don't call it that yet. And this is the internal realm. This is the coastline, so you're getting into North America. So what we have here now, draw a line, you keep it for later, is we have 4 quadrants, and we can graph them, right? If above the line is the world of taxation, and this is the world of the internal, quadrant 1, what would quadrant 1 be? It's the world of what? Above the line taxation, internal, how would you label quadrant 1? Well, use the terminology we're using here. So if this is above the line is the world of taxation, and this is internal, quadrant 1 is what? The world of what? Internal taxation, right. Okay, internal tax. That becomes easy. This is obviously external tax. Quadrant 2. Quadrant 3 is internal legislation, and quadrant 4 is external legislation. Now there's only one question I can ask you at this point in the lecture, which is, what quadrant do the Navigation Acts go in? What quadrant would you place the Navigation Acts in? If you wanted to be accurate. You can place it anyway if you want to be wrong. There's only one right answer. Sorry? So give me numbers. Again, 1, 2. Yes. Quadrant. Who said quadrant 4? You had it right. Okay. Now, I must warn you, my students at Rutgers, some of them will get it right, but when I question them, they'll turn out they're right for the wrong reason. So yes, the Navigation Acts go in quadrant 4. Why do they belong in quadrant 4? It makes them quadrant 4. That's the wrong answer. It's all done by the British government. Everything here, every tax they shouldn't pass but might, and every act of legislation they do would come from the British government. So if that were the case, this wouldn't be very helpful. It would just all be the British government. What makes it quadrant 4? Doesn't matter. Everything starts in London. It's quadrant. Now we can all agree it's below the line because it's not. We all understand it's not taxation, right? The Navigation Acts don't take your property from you. They direct where you should go and what you should do when you're engaging in selling your property. But they don't take a portion of it from you.
It's regulating external affairs.
Yes, exactly. So it clearly is not taxation. It's legislation. What makes it either internal or external is where the action takes place. What the Navigation Acts are saying is when you leave the colonies, don't sail to the French West Indies, don't sail to the Spanish West Indies, don't sail to France or Spain, sail to the British Empire and sell there. So it regulates your behavior and it's external because of where it regulates it. Now what I want to suggest is the kind of empire I've described, this is the safest quadrant you could possibly imagine. I've suggested to you why the Navigation Acts were actually welcomed by North Americans. In fact, they've been able to imagine this dotted line precisely because they have come to accept the importance and significance of parliamentary legislation. And it's taking place out on the oceans, where already by the 1730s and 40s, these acts are largely enforceable because of the power of the British Navy. So here is a place, Quadrant 4, where the colonists acknowledge the legitimate just authority of England, and England has the actual real power to enforce its laws. This is the safest quadrant you can imagine. And for much of the 18th century, this is, I would say, 90% at least of what the empire actually cares about, is the Navigation Acts. Which is why in the 1720s and 1730s and 1740s and 1750s, there's much greater imperial integration and cooperation, and you see the British state reach its zenith, reach its highest point in 1763, when it defeats the French, expels the French state from Canada, and conquers all of the Spanish and French West Indies. They gave it back, probably shouldn't have, they do, but they got it, they did it all, with the overwhelming support and cooperation of the North Americans. Now, I'm going to talk for another 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll take a break. Let me talk a little bit about the culmination of this point of the British reaching its zenith and expelling North America, the French from North America, which is that 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War is the first global war in modern history. It's fought in North America. It's fought in the West Indies. It's fought throughout Europe. It's fought in India. It's fought in the East Indies. It's fought all over the world. But it starts in North America. It's the first one that does. For George Washington, 1754, going out to Virginia, all that kind of thing. But 1756, it's become a global war. But it has a huge presence in North America. It's a major, major, major effort. Now, thinking about the 7 Years' War as an ultimate sort of act of British state policy, what quadrant, when we're talking about North America, not the global war, but the North American participation, what quadrant would the French and Indian War largely go in? Well, no. Yes, the war is happening in North America. So it's here, for the most part. I mean, warfare is a series of policies. You want to direct the behavior of your British subjects to do things to fight a war. We'll also see it kind of here too. Let's talk about it. Now, what this means is that suddenly you're not staying in the place where you have this powerful navy that can police the oceans. What you're doing is you're crossing the line, the solid line, and going into the interior. And think about that interior. It's a huge, vast space, the mainland North American colonies. Yes, it's largely populated, 1.1 million people, which means the size of my city of Philadelphia today, interspersed from Maine to Georgia. This is a dense forest, almost no roads. In other words, there is no equivalent of the British Navy, no state coercive instrument of authority and power that can act and govern and make people do things in here as there can be out here. If you're going to get anything done in here, in this robust, confident British world of 1.2 million subjects who think they're British people, you're going to have to convince them to voluntarily cooperate with you. Now, they can do a lot of that because we've seen the North Americans really think they're British, really like being part of the British Empire. But unlike out here on this side of the line, if they really don't want to do something in here, you can't really make them do it in the way the Navy can really direct power out here. So what do you want in the French and Indian War? Largely what you want is a couple of major things. You want the North American colonies to actively raise their own troops to supplement British troops. And you want them to feed, house, and clothe not just their own troops, but also help in the feeding, housing, and clothing of English troops. You may have heard of things like this. You want to get them to raise money to pay for the British war machine, and you want them to quarter troops. And you know, if you know anything about the coming of the American Revolution, those are the kinds of things that create the conflicts that lead to the breakup of the empire. What I'm going to suggest when we come back in 5 or 7 minutes is show you how those same demands work splendidly in the 7 Years' War. Everything that will cause conflict in the 1760s works in the 1750s and early 1760s. And I'll talk about how and why you can make an empire work. We talk about, because we have the 250th anniversary coming up, about how we stop making an empire work. What I'll first talk about is how we make an empire work, and then spend the rest of our evening together talking about how and why that stops working. But what you want to see is we're going to come back is we're going to learn how you can actually succeed in raising money through taxation in North America, and how you can succeed in getting colonists to commit to, in fact, caring for and provisioning English troops. That can work, and it leads to this spectacular success of the British Empire reaching its zenith. Now, you all look like you're ready and eager to go and want to learn more. So I'm going to say that we're going to make this break. I'm arbitrarily going to use my one authority as a limited constitutional monarch for the evening to say we'll take 6 minutes of break, and then we'll come back. So the 7 Years' War is a massive undertaking. It costs a lot of money. Altogether, the colonists raised in the end between 20 and 30,000 troops. This is, in fact, still to this day, per capita, percentage-wise, the largest percentage of a population of English-speaking people in North America serving in warfare. About 1/7 of military-age men, which at the time was counted as between 18 and 40, served in this war. It's a massive, massive undertaking. And at the start, what the British want the colonists to do is contribute to the cost of this war effort, to pay for parts of it, and to pay for the quartering and the provisioning of troops. Now, the initial effort to do that is led by a man named Lord Loudon, who is the general of the British traditional forces stationed in North America. And what he wants the colonists, the demands of the colonial legislatures, is that they raise funds to pay for troops, and they raise funds to quarter troops. And the way that he goes about doing this is he goes to the governors of these colonies, most of whom are royally appointed, not all, but just about all, and especially in the major theater of war, which is Massachusetts, which has a royally appointed governor. And he directs those governors with his power of command to order the colonial legislatures to raise certain amounts of money to pay for troops and to pay for the quartering of troops. So let's think about that precisely. What you have is a British military command general speaking directly to royally appointed governors, telling them to determine and dictate to colonial legislatures the amount and the method of taxation to pay for the raising of their own provincial troops and for the quartering of both provincial and regular British troops. So just that action as I described it, what quadrant would that go in?
Internal taxation.
Yes. Now think about it, it's a little tricky to think, well wait, but the legislatures would actually be doing the taxing, but they're in the sense of the ventriloquist's dummy of an unaccounted military British commander who is also an aristocrat to boot, an actual lord. So this would not be taxation without representation. This would be the people's legislature, in fact, being dictated to by an unaccountable, unelected figure, determining how much the British colonial subjects should pay. This would then go here. So we'll put Loudon's demands here. And the colonists, Loudon's demands, the colonists react exactly as I've suggested British subjects would. The Massachusetts legislature is furious. In a little-known event in March 2nd of 1758, which I should mention, we don't have time to get into it, but is a pretty gloomy phase of the war. Things had not been going well. The French and Native Alliance, particularly in Maine, which is part of Massachusetts, they're kind of moving down north from Maine, north from Upper Canada and towards Massachusetts. An alliance of Native peoples is pushing really effectively back on the western Massachusetts frontier. In the midst of a time where things have to go well, met with these demands, which they see as a violation of their own British liberties, the Massachusetts legislature announces in March 2nd, 1758, that it's taking Massachusetts out of the war. It will fund no troops, it says, when its British liberties are being violated. Wow, I mean, that's something that no one's ever heard of. 7 days later on March 10th, so obviously it had started well before this because it takes 6 weeks at least for things to get over, a new packet of materials arrived in Massachusetts announcing that Loudon had been recalled and that the new minister, a man named William Pitt, was introducing new methods to achieve the same ends. And what the letters described is a new process in which Pitt would set aside a fund of gold and silver, or what we call specie, to the amount of 200,000 pounds. And what he invited the colonial legislatures to do would be to voluntarily tax themselves. Now, the amount that the colonial legislatures are going to have to tax is much more than 200,000. But what Pitt had said was, if you tax yourselves in your colonial paper currency, a paper currency which is not as valuable as gold and silver, you can draw upon the fund that I've set aside for partial reimbursement of up to 30 to 40%. And so the more you tax yourselves voluntarily, the more you can draw upon this fund and get scarce specie. There's not a lot of gold and silver in the colonies because they tend to have unfavorable balances of trade with Britain. They buy finished manufactured goods, which are more expensive than the raw materials they ship out. The difference is usually made up with gold and silver payments. If you're a merchant in London, you don't necessarily want to accept Massachusetts paper currency. That's not going to get you much in London. You want gold and silver. What Pitt is now saying is we'll set aside a fund. The more you tax yourselves in your own paper currencies and spend it in your colonies to pay for troops and to raise troops, you can draw upon this fund until it's extinguished. Each year, we'll replenish it every year, up to 200,000 pounds. The result is the colonial legislatures begin to compete with each other to try and get access to that fund. They raise voluntarily more taxes between 1759 and 1763 than the famous Stamp Act you've heard about ever demanded that they pay. They quarter troops lavishly. In fact, officers in their diaries talk about how they have never been fed or clothed or housed better than in the North American theater. Many of them opt to stay in North America because they are, in fact, so satisfied with how they've been treated. I have a wonderful graduate student named Dave Nesher. I love Dave Nesher. Dave Nesher taught himself to be a master tailor in the 18th century style. He also taught himself to be a master clockmaker in the 18th century style. He is the chief interpreter at a wonderful museum, if you ever get to Trenton, New Jersey, called the Old Barracks. And tell him I sent you. Dave loves me. He'll give you a great time. The Old Barracks still stands as one of those quarters, one of those barracks built with Pitt's reimbursement money. It's built that well. They've done some work on it. It's still there, right? Now, think about this. As I've described Pitt's method for achieving exactly the same objectives as Loudon, raising funds to pay for troops, quartering troops, what quadrant does that go in?
I'm guessing external taxation.
Okay, you said external. Any other takers?
One, internal.
Internal. I'll now give you a hint. It's a trick question. Remember that I said we did need to be precise about where things were taking place, but I also said everything comes coercively from the British government. The answer is it doesn't go in a quadrant. Is the British government taxing the colonies? No. The colonial legislatures are taxing the colonies. They're choosing to tax themselves and draw upon a specie fund. It's not requiring you to say, if you choose to do this, do it or not. I'm just telling you, there's 200,000 pounds here. And if you tax yourselves, you can draw on it. No liberty has been violated here. The Massachusetts legislature immediately, on March 10th, raised 7,000 troops to pay for the war and drew upon the fund. That same legislature. You know, the same legislature, it's only a week later. Right? No taxation with representation is happening here. No liberty is being violated. Nobody's being coerced to do anything. And what this shows to me is that Pitt has learned, and I'll give you the fancy term now, but now you got the graph, is what Pitt understands is that he lives in what we would call a federal empire. Now, we live in a federal system of government. What does that mean? When we say we have a federal system of government, what does the word federal mean? Yeah, it means that, but it means something else.
Power sharing between state and federal.
Exactly, and also local, right? That power now, I think we probably agree it's kind of gone in favor of the national lately, but for the last 100 years or so. But yes, a federal system means that power is not concentrated in one place. Now, there's no belief system, there's no ideology that can justify that the empire is a federal system. What there is the reality of this line and 3,000 miles in an ocean. You simply don't have the power here if you're the British state that you have here. And people like Pitt know that. And what they say is, we've got to go in here and we've got to conduct business. The French are out there, they're dangerous, we hate them, they hate them, we've got to get this war won. But I can't go in there and act as if I have the power I have out here in here. What I have to do is figure out a way to work with my fellow British subjects to get them to voluntarily cooperate with broad British imperial goals. My goals are no different from Loudon's, my methods are profoundly different. And there's a difference between zero funding the war on March 2nd and paying for 7,000 troops on March 10th, because no British liberties have been violated. Now again, as I said, quartering troops, check. Paying to fund troops, check. That happens in the 7 Years' War by the approach that doesn't violate the colonists' sense of their own British liberties. And the result, as I've said, is the triumph of 1763 when they've conquered all of Canada, they've conquered the French and Spanish West Indies, and Pitt is the hero of North America. Pittsfield, Massachusetts, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Fort Pitt. They're naming things after him. Literally, they're erecting statues in the name of Pitt. Pitt is the great commoner, the great hero, the savior of North America, a beloved figure who at this moment is also the first minister of the British Empire. British politics are complicated. We always think it's North America. All these people fall from power. It has nothing to do with North America. He's got personal disagreements with the king. He falls from power. He doesn't stay. But what the 7 Years' War shows is there a way you could lose an empire? Oh, yes. You could be Loudon. Is there a way you can win and keep an empire? Yes, you can be Pitt. And you can do that by drawing upon the cooperative, loyal commitment of British subjects, which isn't a Pollyannish, mindless loyal commitment. They have a sense of liberties and a sense of rights, and they will zero fund a war if you violate them, but they will also commit to broad imperial public goals if you treat them as the British subjects they know they are. And Pitt does that. Okay? As I say, Pitt falls from power. And now we get into the interesting period that ostensibly you all thought you came to hear about tonight. It's day 20, so I'm going to read about it. It's replaced by a man named George Grenville. British politics being what they are, I'm not making this up, Pitt's brother-in-law, believe it or not. He is. But Grenville has a different approach, and I've had more time, and I'd get into it. There's different ways to think of, actually, well, I guess I will. Think about what Pitt did in his methods, his specie fund, his voluntary cooperation. Is that a sign of imperial strength or imperial weakness? Well, I think it's strength. 3,000 miles in an ocean away, with no actual ability to make anybody do anything, you figure out a way to ask colonists to do what you want, and they do it. You think, yeah, but 200,000 pounds. Remember what I said the British debt was by 1763? It was 140 million pounds. You think they're worrying about 200,000? This is a rounding error for William Pitt. He's saying, I once figured it's 1/10 of 1% of the debt. Pitt said, for a price that couldn't matter less, the colonists have contributed everything I wanted, and we've conquered Canada, and we've defeated the French, and we've conquered all the Spanish and French West Indies. What are you thinking giving it back? That's crazy, let's keep it all. But the money is nothing. It couldn't matter less, the money we spent. And remember, that's actually only reimbursing about a third of what they spent anyway. They spent far more than we did, and we got them to want to do it. I see that as incredible strength for an 18th century empire. That's impressive. I mean, it's kind of hard sometimes for, Lansing to get you to do things. I mean, this is an incredible achievement. On the other hand, if you're someone like George Grenville, he might say, well, we're Parliament, damn it. Lines. We are the sovereign authoritative government of the British Empire. They zero-funded the war. They disrespected our British military. We have to teach them to respect British authority, and we cannot be pussyfooting around and playing these games that are just simply causing us to look like the less authoritative force than we know we are. And so when they decide to reduce the force, the war's over, they don't need to keep it all, they begin to reduce the British presence. They actually, with the colonists' willing support, maintain 10,000 troops in North America, stationed all the way here on the edges, all the way up by the Appalachian Mountains. Because while the French state is gone, there's still plenty of French people still living in North America, and there's still a very robust native alliance that is, for understandable reasons, not happy with this English juggernaut that's spreading west. And so all North Americans and British know they want to still have a powerful British military presence. And the question becomes, okay, well, how do you pay for those troops? This shouldn't be a hard question. 10,000 is nothing. It was about a third of what they'd had during the war. A lot less costly. And there's a clear method for how to do it. And the colonists expect it to happen. But Grenville doesn't do that. Instead he does what I think you all probably know, or some of you do. He passes two new laws. The Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765. I'm going to get into the complications of it. I'll just say the Sugar Act is a tax that essentially makes French, believe it or not, French West Indian molasses legal. It says, you know what, forget about the Navigation Acts. Actually, you can go trade with the French West Indies, but we're going to charge 3 pence per gallon for every gallon of French molasses you buy. And we'll keep that. The British money is divided into 3 portions: pounds, shilling, and pence. So 1 pence would be the smallest denomination. So what they say is we're going to charge 3 pence per gallon of every gallon of French molasses you buy. We'll collect, our customs agents will collect that back by the Navy. We'll use that as, we'll have revenue. We'll help it to defray the cost of the 10,000 troops. So this is a tax, right? You're saying we're now going to, as you go about your behavior of trading in now this legal trade, we're making it legal because we're going to raise revenue off your actions and we're going to keep it for ourselves. And then he passes the next year in 1765 a stamp tax. And what the Stamp Act requires is that there should be literally a physical stamp on virtually every kind of paper product you could imagine. Wills, newspapers, decks of playing cards, virtually marriage licenses, any kind of public instrument, any paper product will have to have a stamp, which the wholesaler distributing is making that product. If you're a minister, you create marriage licenses. If you're a lawyer, you draw up legal documents. If you're the state legislature, you issue laws on paper. If you're a newspaper editor, you issue newspaper. You have to go to a stamp distributor's office and purchase that stamp for your paper product to be legal. And it's the act of collecting the money that the stamp costs that is the revenue that gets raised. And that will also go to defray the costs of this British troop. So these are two taxes. Unambiguous taxes now being passed to raise revenue on the actions of colonial North Americans. Now, you all know how they would feel about that. We've already talked about that. What I want to do is go back to our picture. So think about the Sugar Act as I described it. What quadrant does it go in? Yes. Note that the action that's being taxed is when you leave North America and you go to the French West Indies. And often that tax will be collected before you even get back to North America. It will usually be collected when you put into port in the British West Indies. Or if you get back to North America, it's taxed right on the line in the coastal harbors of North America, where the Navy and the customs men, salaried British officials, do have authority and power. It's not in here in the interior, right, very far away. So the Sugar Act is an external tax in 1764. The first one Parliament ever enacted formally. The first actual effort to try to take revenue from the colonists through their actions. The colonists explode in anger. James Otis, I've just written a 66-page draft chapter about it. James Otis writes a paper called The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Improved, saying, as British subjects, we can only be taxed by representative legislative bodies. Parliament is not a representative legislative body. The Sugar Act violates our own shared British values. What quadrant does the Stamp Act? Yes, the Stamp Act is when you walk down the street to your lawyer and you arrange for a will. He's had to pay for a stamp to make that will legal. He's going to pass that cost off to you by making you pay for the cost of the stamp on top of the cost of the legal work he's done for you. Multiply that by everybody who buys a deck of playing cards, who buys a newspaper, everywhere in colonial America. So the Stamp Act is here. Now, how many of you have heard of the Stamp Act? Some people have heard of it. Who's heard of the Sugar Act? You heard of it. You heard it.
We've been discussing these things.
Okay, oh, you've been discussing, right, okay. But would you agree the Sugar Act is not quite as famous? Right? Note that while the colonists have no trouble denouncing the ideological horror of both taxes, above the line, equally wrong, what you might not know is the Sugar Act goes into effect and is collected effectively. Because how would you really stop it? It's collected usually outside of North America. It's directly overseen by the Navy and the customs men. You can't really physically prevent the act from going into effect and being collected, though you certainly can denounce it, and James Otis did. No trouble, 1764. The Stamp Act, you probably heard, led to riots, led to absolute refusal, the same reaction as Lord Loudon got. There would be no cooperation with this act, which could only be carried out internally. Also note how many people have to be involved in actually assessing and collecting the Stamp Act. It's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people. Well, you can't pay for 1,000 people to come over from Britain. You'd have to pay for them and their families. You'd have to pay them a salary to make them worth their while. It would cost more to send British agents of the state over and have them paid to be stamp distributors than the act itself would collect. What you need to get is colonists, as maybe a sideline, side hustle to their own businesses, spend a bit of time selling stamps, which means that when the act is announced, in every village in colonial America, the question becomes, who's going to be the stamp distributor? Let's go get that guy and let him know he better not do it. This is the difference between this line, this side of the line, and this side of the line. Any action inside here is vulnerable to what the boots on the ground, the people who are never going away, your neighbors, your friends for now, what they want to happen in their communities. whereas the Sugar Act is going to be overseen by the salaried customs agents of the Navy, agents of the Empire protected by the Navy. So while both acts are denied and denounced, the Stamp Act is nullified before it can even go into effect, whereas the Sugar Act begins to work. And this further gives evidence of what I call the federal empire, right? The fact is that whether it's something the colonists say you can do, the navigation acts work unproblematically, whereas it's difficult to get things like the 7 Years' War done unless you're working with them. While the external Sugar Act, which is equally seen as wrong as the internal Stamp Act, can actually be policed and enforced, and the Stamp Act cannot. Now, regardless of what colonists say or what Parliament says, the colonists say you cannot act down here. You can act down here. You may not act up here. Someone like Grenville says, excuse me, that's ridiculous. We're sovereign. We can act everywhere. Neither view is correct. In reality, what Parliament can do is it can act on the oceans, whether it legislates or whether it taxes, and it will not be able to act internally unless the colonists voluntarily cooperate with it. Well, as we've seen, you can get them to voluntarily cooperate for you with legislation. Pitt did that in the war. What we've seen is that you will never get them with the Stamp Act to ever act voluntarily and cooperatively when it's an internal tax. So if this is the absolute safest quadrant, below the line and ideologically unobjectionable, this is the most dangerous quadrant. Above the line and profoundly ideologically objectionable, and the Stamp Act suffers the fate you would expect. What's interesting is that Grenville, again, not for anything to do with this, bad relations with the king, the king's mother hates him, he falls from power soon after passing these acts. Then there's a back and forth with some ministries. One guy literally drops dead of a heart attack on his way, I think, to probably send troops to North America, believe it or not, November 31st, the king's uncle. It doesn't happen. The point is that after a bit of a, ring around the rosy, there comes in November of 1766 a new minister named the Marquis of Rockingham. And Rockingham by this point has heard about the riots, he understands the problems, he does, this is a disaster, and I didn't create it, I didn't do this act. Also, Rockingham is a guy who has deep relations with the London merchant community, and he's saying, why are we disrupting this empire that worked so well just 2 years ago? How do we get out from under this? And so what he does is he begins to assemble all kinds of smart, imperially minded men. He calls in the London mercantile community. He calls on some of the most sophisticated, what we would call sort of economic pundits of the day, guys who argue about, write pamphlets about commerce. He dines with Benjamin Franklin over a series of weeks in November of 1765. And what they come up with is three-part connected pieces of legislation to resolve the Stamp Act crisis. The first thing they do is they repeal the Stamp Act in November of 1765. It's taken away and done. And never again does Parliament tax internally at any point going forward. No internal taxes are ever passed again. With the Sugar Act, they reduce the duty even lower from 3 pence per gallon on French molasses to 1 pence per gallon, which becomes very affordable. And they also then extend that duty to English molasses as well. They, in a sense, create free trade for English and French molasses. Now, is this a tax? Yes. But given that everybody's been focusing on the Stamp Act, which is seen as such a terrible and horrible threat, and as this actually becomes very affordable and merchants want to do it, and the tax is largely hidden, and the merchants quietly pay it and then pass it off to colonial consumers who largely never see it being collected, it kind of slips out of consciousness. And believe it or not, the Sugar Act remains on the books from 1766, and it's reduced 1 pence per gallon for English and French molasses.
Is that like a tariff?
A very low one, right?
Close to tariff.
Yeah. Till 1775, and brings in about 30,000 pounds a year. So if you're measuring just what Parliament can do or not do, Parliament had never taxed prior to 1764. The outcome of the Stamp Act is they actually are taxing the colonists in 1766, but they've learned the lesson of imperial federalism. He retreats from the internal realm. He beefs up, and Franklin said, at one point he's questioned by the House of Commons, and he literally says, the oceans are yours. What he's saying is, stay away from the internal realm unless you can get them to cooperate with you. And he then spends a lot of time precisely describing the reimbursement methods of Pitt, and bringing that into the discussion. You put aside the specie, you did this worked. Rockingham learns that lesson. And he resolves the crisis along the line that matters. And the point I'm making is that as long as you're understanding the lessons of imperial federalism, and only not intruding where you must never intrude without provoking the colonists, only intruding in here when you can get it to work as Pitt did, and focusing on those areas where you really have power, you can end crises in the empire. And you can see this lesson being learned because in the next crisis, which I won't spend a lot of time on because that's not the topic of this lecture, the Townshend Acts crisis, that's a new series of taxes that gets passed in 1767, and they're all external. They place taxes on goods that colonists buy from Britain. Taxes on lead, paint, window glass, most famously tea. Now these are the ultimate external taxes. They literally are paid as duties of export in Britain before merchants even leave for colonial America. No colonial American sees them being taxed, and they're simply passed on to colonial consumers through a rise in price to cover the taxes that were paid back in Britain. Now, colonial pamphleteers, who are often legally trained, sharp-minded lawyers, know these acts have been passed, and they say the same things about them that Otis had said about the External Sugar Act and other pamphleteers had said about the Stamp Act. They're wrong, they're awful, they're a violation of our rights, and yet for 2 years they work. There's no riots, there's no uprisings, they're largely ignored or even unknown in colonial America, despite the efforts of pamphleteers to gin everybody up. And they're right. I mean, their argument is if this body can tax, it doesn't matter where it does it. If an unrepresentative body claims it can tax you, there's no limit to how it might tax you, and it could tax away all your property. The constitutional argument is sound, but it's hidden, it's not really seen, and it's in these places where it's not really disrupting the wealth of the empire, and people are largely able to afford what are light duties. And so they're not galvanized in the way they were by the very in-your-face Stamp Act that they were confronted with directly that was affecting them in their everyday lives all the time. However, the Townshend Acts does begin to create conflict. And I'll go through it very quickly because this will get us to the Coercive Acts. It's been working for 2 years, so they're passed in 1767. You may know that there were boycott movements against the Townshend Acts. They don't start until 1769. So for 2 years, the Townshend Acts are being collected exactly the way people like Franklin had predicted they would be, exactly in ways that reinforces our understanding of the significance of this line, even if there's no belief system available that could explain this line. The colonists think it's this line. Parliament thinks there are no lines. But the physical reality is that the colonists have power in here to decide what will happen, and Parliament has the power to decide out here what will happen. And they're acting along that understanding. Rockingham falls pretty quickly, as tends to happen in the volatile British politics. And in late 1768, a new figure who's overseeing colonial affairs, a man named the Earl of Hillsborough, grows angry at the constant drip and drumbeat of pamphlets denouncing the Townshend Acts. Now, I got to think if you're coming from the Pitt world or the Rockingham mindset, you might say, I don't care that there are pamphlets denouncing the Townshend Acts. They're working. They're bringing in £30,000 a year. Nobody's paying attention to the pamphleteers. They're sort of angry voices in the crowd not doing much. Let's focus on the actual actions that's happening rather than on your sense that your authority is being disrespected. Hillsborough doesn't do that. And he issues directives to the colonial governors of North America, telling them that they can tell their legislatures to stop passing resolutions against the Townshend Acts. Again, the Townshend Acts are working, they're effective. Many of the governors say we think that's a bad idea, but Hillsborough orders them to do it and tells them the governors to threaten the legislatures that if they don't stop rescinding, if they don't stop denouncing the Townshend Acts, that they will be dissolved. It sounds a little more extreme than it is. Dissolving a legislature doesn't mean eradicating it forever. It means dissolving the sitting legislature and calling for new elections. Still, it's a big thing. What you're in a sense saying is, if you, the legislatures, the people's legislatures of colonial America, don't bow to our tune and discuss what we're telling you to discuss and not discuss what we're not telling you to discuss, we'll dissolve you and demand new elections until we get a legislature that will be compliant. So that is really threatening the autonomy of these representative bodies of the people. Faced with that demand, what's interesting is that not all of the colonial legislatures had even taken a stand on the Townshend Acts, only some had, but all the colonial legislatures faced with this threat say, well, now we have to denounce the Townshend Acts, and now we have to actually try to resist the Townshend Acts, because if we don't do it, we'll be suggesting that we didn't do it because Britain said we couldn't do it. And that will be undermining our capacity as legislatures to be the autonomous representative bodies that we want to be. One of the great counterfactual questions I've always pondered is, what if Hillsborough had a bit more of the mentality of Pitt or Rockingham? Because the Townshend Acts were working. There are no boycott movements prior to his threats. There's no real physical resistance to the Townsend Acts. But once the threat comes to the legislatures, not only do they all denounce them, but you get organized bodies returning. The Sons of Liberty, which had disbanded in 1766, reform in 1769, start organizing boycott movements, and they begin to stop buying the Townsend Acts goods. Now, this is a real escalation of the crisis, and we can see it on the graph. Because if you think about it, back in 1766, it got resolved along the line that had always mattered. All Parliament was doing when it retreated from the internal realm of the Stamp Act was giving up power it had never actually had anyway. But now that the Townsend Acts have been brought into this, and again, not because of the taxes themselves, which were working, but because of the threats to the colonial legislatures that are connected to the Townsend Acts, now suddenly you can't resolve this crisis as the way you did the Stamp Act crisis. Remember, that was just, let's get rid of the taxes internally, and we'll just tax externally. But if you take that mode now to solve the crisis, since you've already retreated from the internal realm, Parliament no longer taxing there, if you now just give up on all the Townsend Acts, you'd be giving up on the external realm too, which means you'd be saying you can't tax at all, which would be acknowledging the colonists are defining what the empire is, which is a place where Parliament can't tax. So in seeking to resolve the now problem of the external taxes, they decide the best plan they have is to repeal most of the Townsend Acts. And they keep, most famously, the one Townsend Act that they retain is the tax on tea. So tea remains taxed. And tea then becomes a toxic commodity in colonial America. Don't drink the tea. Smuggle in Dutch tea. Don't drink British tea. Tea is a tax of oppression. And when you convince, and mostly tea drinkers are women, and when colonial patriotic men convince their wives to stop drinking tea, they'll celebrate their wives, they'll praise them as daughters of liberty, they'll go to the tavern and drink toast after toast to the great patriotic women of North America. And do you know what the most popular drink to toast in the tavern is? No, of course not tea. These men aren't going to go to the tavern and drink tea. What are they going to drink in the taverns? Alcohol, but whiskey is now grain is too valuable a commodity. You got to eat the grain. Rum punch. Rum is made from sugar, which comes from the West Indies, which is taxed. And so these men are going to the tavern and saying, "Thank you, ladies, for not drinking your tea," by drinking a taxed commodity. I've always felt there was also a gendered dimension to which tax is going to be stopped and which will not be stopped. But again, it's largely that this has just fallen away and nobody's kind of even remembered it. But the point is that tea now becomes a really, really oppressive, angry, galvanizing commodity. Jump ahead a few years, new ministry now, the North Ministry, and the only thing that's left, everybody's kind of forgotten about the fact that sugar's actually still bringing in plenty of money, sugar and molasses, but now taxation has become a huge point of conflict. Again, I think the escalation of the threat to the legislatures didn't have to happen. It did happen. It created this. Again, there's a lot of blunders here.
So what, they got the Boston Tea Party?
Very good, my man. And so what North says is we've got to figure out a way to convince these crazy colonists that a government that is supposed to tax to be able to defend us all against the French is not trying to destroy their liberties, but is in fact trying to do its job. How can we reintroduce them to the power of parliamentary taxation? And so what he comes up with is a new act, which they repeal the last Townsend Act on tea and replace it with the Tea Act of 1773, which I actually think is a very ingeniously plotted tax. Because what the Tea Act does is it gives a monopoly of power to sell tea in North America to the British East India Tea Company, which is in a lot of financial trouble and needs a boost. So what he says is, under the Tea Act, the only wholesaler that can legally sell tea in North America will be the British East India Tea Company, which gets the tea all the way from India, brings it to England, then sells it. They'll have a monopoly. Now, that's largely inconveniencing other English merchant tea wholesalers. That's not really hurting a lot of colonial Americans. It says, however, in exchange for this huge, vast market that you're going to be given a monopoly to, the East India Tea Company, we're going to tax you on the tea. So the British East India Tea Company will be paying the tax, and then it will be presumably passing that cost on to the colonial consumer. But, says Lord North, in order to do that, you have to promise, given the huge, vast market and the volume of bulk of profit you're going to make, that the price you sell to the colonial consumer for tea must be lower than the existing market price prior to the Tea Act. And the East India Tea Company, given the volume of colonial consumption, can make money selling tea at a lower price than it had ever been sold in North America before. And what North says is, not even crazy Bostonians are going to break up an empire over a policy that taxes them to lower the price of their tea. That they'll accept. Then they'll realize that taxation is not a dangerous power. It's benign. We're the good guys. We're the Protestants who love liberty too. This is all going to work out. What's interesting is the person who thinks that this just might be the one where they finally screw the Sons of Liberty is Sam Adams, who is terrified of the Tea Act. In a Boston meeting on December 11th, he said, and I quote, let me get his quote here. I'll have to find it. This is a problem. It's supposed to be this big dramatic moment. Now I can't find the quote. He says, oh, no, that's right. It's on this piece of paper. He says in the Boston town meeting, he could not trust the private virtue of his countrymen in refraining from the use of the tea. If the tea gets here, says Sam Adams, I worry they're going to drink it. They're going to think it's fine, and that will kind of undermine our claim that we represent the people and their liberties. And we just can't let that tea get here. We can't let it get here. I don't trust the virtue of my fellow Bostonians. Now, this becomes weirdly an external, I've said external taxes can be enforced. The Tea Act, as ingenious as it is the one external tax that actually could be defeated with internal measures. Because the reason why it's hard to maintain boycotts of all external taxes is because there's huge volumes of ships coming in. And you don't know what goods they have. Are some of them taxed by the Townsend Acts or others not? You can't police the wars forever. Those boycott movements fall apart in about a year. They don't last for very long. But the Tea Act is one company. It literally has an East India insignia on the side. It sells one thing. You can ignore every other ship in the harbor and just focus on the East India ships. My favorite is my home city of Philadelphia. If you've ever been there, you know that Philadelphia exists inland from the Delaware River, which means that ocean-going vessels sail up the river, and they're piloted by skilled pilots, and it takes about 30 hours for them to go from coast to city. And you can travel on a horse way faster than those ships. It takes about 5 hours on a horse. Everybody knows what ships are coming into Philadelphia. Everybody knows if it's East India ships coming in, and they're ready. And so, in 1773, an East India Tea Company ship finally gets to the wharf, and it's met in Philadelphia by a committee that is literally called the Committee for Tarring and Feathering. That's its name. As I say to my students, they've got one job to do, right? They tar and they feather. And the committee meets the captain of the ship at the wharf, the East India steamer, and they say, and I'll quote, his name is Captain Ayers, and they say to him, the Committee for Tarring and Feathering says, "What think you, Captain, of a halter around your neck, 10 gallons of liquid tar decanted on your pate, your head?" That's what they do. They're the committee. They got to do this. "With the feathers of a dozen wild geese laid over that to enliven your appearance. Only think seriously of this, and fly to the place from whence you came. Fly without hesitation, without the formality of protest. And above all, Captain Ayers, let us advise you to fly without the wild geese feathers." And he says to the harbor master, "May I have papers to sail away without landing my tea?" And the harbor master says, "I don't need this mess here. Here are your papers. Go away." And that's what happens in every port down the line. You can't land the tea in the ports. And then, in early December of 1773, 3 East India Tea Company ships steam into the Boston harbor. And Governor Thomas Hutchinson has had it with this. He says, clearly, this is a violation of law. The Tea Act is the most benign and generous tax you could ever imagine. Sam Adams is an insane crank. I've got to stop him. And when he says to his harbor master, "Do not give those ships permission to leave the harbor." Well, in the 18th century British Empire, you can't sail anywhere without papers of permission. And that means that you have to either get the permission to leave, or a clock starts running of 2 weeks where bills of lading that have come in with ships are attached to goods that will either leave with permission of paper or will be brought on shore and sold at public auction. And Sam Adams, that's why they have the town meeting where Adams says, if this stuff gets on shore, they're going to buy it. We can't let that happen. And as the clock is running on December 15th with 2 days to go, we all know what happens. They have the Boston Tea Party and they throw the tea overboard. 342 chests of tea, current price probably around $2 million worth of tea, just from these 3 ships. A very expensive party. And now the British have had it. And to be honest, I think we can kind of maybe sympathize a little. I mean, like, what more can we do, say the British? This tea has never been cheaper. We're clearly not trying to obliterate your liberties. On the other hand, isn't the constitutional argument also powerful? If a body that we do not choose can tax us, why should we trust your goodwill now when we give up the authority over our property? What I always tell my students is both positions are powerfully compelling in a community that did not want to have a conflict and can't get out of it. And so what the British now say is we need to demonstrate authority and power and the rule of law. And we want to do this powerfully, literally coercively, but also sensibly and even humanely. The Tea Party didn't happen, we'll ignore Ayers. Nobody else destroyed property, only Boston and Massachusetts did. We will pass a series of acts, which we are not going to hide, we're going to call them the Coercive Acts, aimed only at Massachusetts, to demonstrate to the rest of the colonies that bad behavior will be punished, but good behavior will be rewarded. The Coercive Acts, there are 4, and they are this. The first is the Boston Port Act. And the Boston Port Act says that the Boston port will be closed until all the tea is paid for. A terrible imposition. Over half of Boston, either directly or indirectly, works through the port. All sorts of men and women are thrown out of work, and how will they generate the income to ever pay for the tea? So this is a punitive action shutting down Boston, a major port city of the British Empire. The second of the Coercion Acts passed a much stronger quartering act, which obligates, no reimbursement, no pit methods, demands money to pay for troops that are now stationed not in the West but moved to Boston. They had already been there, but more are moved to Boston. And for the first time gives the commander of those troops, a man named General Thomas Gage, the authority to quarter troops in private homes if barracks are not built for them. That had never been a right before in any previous quartering act, now it is. The third is called the Administration of Justice Act. And what it says is if an agent of the British Empire, either civilian or military, is accused of a crime, he will not be tried in a civilian court, but will be tried in an admiralty court, a court of the Navy. Now, I haven't mentioned the Boston Massacre, which happened in 1770. You probably know famously that when the troops fired into the crowd and killed 5 Bostonians, they were tried in a civil Boston court. They actually were acquitted, and John Adams defended them. But now what the Administration of Justice Act is saying is if something like that were to happen again, it would not be a civilian court trying them, which presumably would a local Boston court, which could presumably care about what happened to Bostonians. It would be a British military court, which would be much more lenient and would likely let its soldiers go, which is why the Administration of Justice Act is called in Boston the Murder Act. So it's encouraging the soldiers to murder us. And the final of the 4 is called the Massachusetts Government Act, which simply forcibly amends the Charter of Massachusetts, beefing up royal authority in Massachusetts, making much more of the government of Massachusetts royally appointed rather than elected, and limits town meetings to 1 per year. Now, it turns out, however, that in Boston, already in Massachusetts by 1760, there's already 1 British-trained common lawyer for every 5 Congregationalist ministers. In 1700, there would have been almost no common lawyers. Already, they're 20% the population of the Congregationalist ministers. From that point forward, it only goes in favor of the lawyers. There's probably 10,000 lawyers in Massachusetts a day for every Congregationalist minister. They got a lot of trained lawyers. And one smart lawyer says, if you never officially adjourn the meeting, it's actually the same meeting. And so they just don't adjourn and they meet every night, but it's 1 meeting. What's interesting is General Gage says, well, that's actually true. I'm a man of the law as well. It is the same meeting. I got no power here. They got to just keep meeting. So they meet every night anyway. But the point is that these acts are meant to be powerful, coercive examples of power about what happens to you if you transgress the British government. Now, what quadrant do the Coercive Acts go in? No. What quadrant do the Coercive Acts? Shut down the port, which is, let's call it, well, the port is not the oceans, right? It's the city of Boston. Forcibly amend the Massachusetts government, limit how much Boston and other towns can meet, and change the charter, and impose. I should also mention they make General Gage the commander of the troops, the new governor of Massachusetts. So in a sense, put Massachusetts, I guess a pretty big part of it, the Massachusetts government. I put them under a military rule. What quadrant do those acts go in? Yes. These aren't taxes. In fact, the Boston Port Act is the antithesis of a tax, right? It's all legislation. And that's the point of no return. Because note here, when the colonists had denounced everything else that had been happening, What the colonists were saying is, we want Parliament to live up to our understanding of the empire, the way we understand how the empire works. Go back to the world before you taxed us, which isn't in some distant past. It's the year of 1763, the year of the greatest triumph of the empire. It's the taxation that's, in fact, one of the chief critics of the Townshend Acts, a man named John Dickinson, when he was struggling for a word to truly talk about how terrible the Townshend Acts were, those external taxes in the Second Great Crisis, he's trying to think, how can I explain to Britain just how wrong these taxes are? And he finally came up with a word to truly show how despicable they were. And the word he called them was innovation. These taxes are an innovation. They're a change over the wonderful world we used to have. And as I always tell my students, if you are denouncing innovation, the last thing you are is a revolutionary. What you are is literally a conservative, a classic sense of a conservative who wants to conserve the world you used to have. Now, however, think about it. For the first time with the Coercive Acts, the colonists have to challenge their own understanding of the empire. They've always said that legislation was not the threat to liberty. It was the unrepresentative power to take property away through taxation. What the Coercive Acts forced them to confront is that the power to legislate is actually a far greater threat to liberty than anything that the power to tax might be. The idea that you would forcibly change the charter of 1691, that's how long it's been there. The idea that you would impose military rule upon Massachusetts, that you could enclose the third largest city in the colony's port and take away the livelihood of 7,000 to 8,000 men. If that's legislation, then you're legislating away British liberty. If Parliament thinks it can use legislation to do that, well, then Parliament can't be given the power to legislate. But if you said all along that you can't tax, and now you're saying you can't legislate, what can Parliament do? And the answer is it can't do anything. And that's independence. And they're terrified of that conclusion. They realized that in the First Continental Congress of 1774, that in fact what they've come to realize is that if they're going to deny Parliament the power to tax and legislate, they're calling for a fundamental transformation of the empire and their relationship to it, in which they're denying Parliament any authority to do anything in North America at all. And what this leads to is one of my favorite documents, the statement that comes out of the First Continental Congress, which is sent to Parliament and the King. And in it, they denounce Parliament's power to legislate, they denounce Parliament's power to tax, they insist that Parliament has no authority over them, and they close with this statement. And what they say is, however, we the colonists shall, quote, cheerfully consent to the operation of such acts of the British Parliament as are bona fide, restrained to the regulation of our external commerce. And what is the regulation of their external commerce? What does that? The Navigation Acts. Now note here, what they said here is, we will cheerfully consent to the Navigation Acts. You don't have the authority to legislate for us. Because if we grant you the authority to legislate, which includes the Navigation Acts we like, that same power to legislate is the power to enact the Coercive Acts, which we cannot allow. So you cannot legislate. But you know what? We're going to still consent to those Navigation Acts, and we'll do it. They love, as I said, this is the safest quadrant. They don't want to leave it. And this is 1774. They're saying, we still want the Navigation Acts. We want to remain in commercial relationship and partnership with you, but it can only come with our consent. Consent, which we always gave here, now has to extend here, and under those conditions we'll stay. They send it out. The First Continental Congress dissolves in October of 1774. They say, we'll meet again in May, and let's hope it happens. And of course, you know, therefore, in May, they meet 1 month after Lexington and Concord, and they come back, and they've inherited a war. And clearly, the empire has not accepted the cheerful consent to agreeing to the Navigation Acts. And now, what was a point of no return, them upending their own understanding of the empire, denying Parliament all authority, has led to a firefight. And George Washington famously shows up. He still fits his old 7 Years' War military uniform. John Adams, who's desperate to make sure this isn't just a Massachusetts problem, which remember the Coercive Acts are, say, let's get the guy in the uniform and send him up to Massachusetts, and it'll become Virginia's problem too. Years later, he said, I made that man, and then he became the father of his country. It was all me, and he just doesn't like George Washington very much. He's frustrated. He says at one point, the entire revolution is the story that George Washington wielded his sword, and Franklin smoted his lightning rod, and the two of them together enacted everything and led all the armies and drove the revolution, and no one talks about me anymore. Well, you know, in the end, he got a mini-series, which is all right. But that's why I say the Coercive Acts are the fundamental rupture. Because suddenly, if the colonists are now going to reject their own understanding of the empire, they've become the innovators. they're now thinking in innovative ways about what Parliament can and can't do, and the conclusion is it can't do anything, and the only reason they're going to continue to have the things they like is because they themselves have consented to it. Well, obviously, King and Parliament just cannot agree to that. They reject those suggestions, and the war commences. Just briefly, and then we're done, and there'll be some time for questions about, well, in a minute, unless you want to stay later. What's interesting is, and I'll leave you with this, is that in 1774 and 5, no one will accept that deal in England. But then, a few years of fighting, it's a lot harder than they thought. The French come in with the alliance in 1778. Suddenly, this is a global war, but now it's a war with North America on the side of France and not Britain. Britain gets worried. It thinks it might lose its British West Indies, and they offer the same deal back in 1778. They say, you know what? If you're willing to come back into commercial partnership with us on your own terms, we can create an empire of that, like that. And the colonists at this point say, no, it's too far gone. You've committed atrocities. You've killed us. You've burned and raped and done all these terrible things. We haven't been either. There's no way we're coming back. But it's only 4 years. What if England had been willing to offer accept in 1774 what the colonists were offering, which it did become willing to accept in 1778? What if you reverse that? Well, what we'd have is the 19th century British Empire of the Commonwealth system, of the white settler colonies of Canada, South Africa, and Australia, living in a broad oceanic commercial partnership with Britain, largely over the course of the 19th century being granted more and more and more internal autonomy. That's what, in other words, we have a federal government, as that gentleman said up there. Britain learns the lesson of federalism too and constructs its 19th century empire to great victory around the conditions they could never quite get to in the 18th century with North America. And what we had in the 18th century was a federal system without a justifying federal belief system. In the 19th century, they have both a federal empire encompassing the globe with a belief system to explain why it should be that way. And both sides learn these lessons. We create a federal system of government for North America. Britain creates a global imperial federal system for its highly successful 19th century empire. But by that point, it's too late to include what is now the independent United States. The end. Well, we're at time, so I'll leave it to you.
You always got a question.
Up there.
Why again was the Sugar Act taken gracefully?
So if you look at what I call rhetorical opposition, the world of ideas and words, it's denounced as fervently as the Stamp Act. In fact, it comes first, and James Otis has no trouble denouncing it as an unconstitutional tax on the same grounds as the Stamp Act will be denounced 1 year later. He's not even certain there will be another tax at the time he can denounce it. My point is that you have to always balance the world of ideas against the hard material reality of the world people are actually living in. Franklin's word for the difference, at one point a member of Parliament asked exactly your question, says, why exactly do you say there's a difference, what's the difference between external and internal taxes? And Franklin's answer is to say, it is a very material difference, by which he means a difference in the reality of the world. You can enforce external taxes. You have the authority on the oceans to oversee and collect them. You don't internally. Focus on where you can enforce. Now, on the colonial side, where they're focusing so much on the tax that's most visible to them, I mean, think about it this way. You pay a sales tax every time you buy something. Do you really know where that sales tax starts and the price of your goods stops? You never think about it. You just pay the good. You're being taxed every time you go to the store. But you don't know how much. But you know about your income tax. You know what your property tax is. That's very visible and physical in your face because it's you're directly paying it. Nobody's directly paying the Sugar Act. It's being collected far away in the West Indies. It's, or by customs agents. The way then wholesalers sell it to resellers, passing the price off. Retailers sell it to consumers, passing the price off. And the consumer doesn't even know he's paid the tax. And so the point that people like Franklin are making is, think about the reality of your federal system. Focus on where you have power and focus on where you can do things that will not stoke in the colonists a sense of the violation of their own liberty, and don't do those things that will, because you don't have the power to get away from it and you can lose an empire that way. And what I'm showing is with all the examples is that insight is borne out again and again and again. And it gets to a point where people don't learn those lessons. Some do and things work, some don't and they don't. And you get to a point where suddenly you have the Coercive Acts, and then there's no parliamentary authority you can allow. Right. So that, as I said, that's crazy in that they finally come up with a tax that should work, but it's the one external tax that's as visible as an internal tax. They don't have to think about all the other ships. They just have to think about this one ship. They can focus and identify it very easily. And now the world has also changed. 1773 is a much angrier world than 1766. The legislatures have all been dissolved. Threats have been done. The Boston Massacre has happened. Not only are people now much, much more suspicious of parliamentary power than they were 5 years ago, but they now have an external tax that is as visible and therefore as provoking as the Stamp Act had been, in a way that no other external tax had ever been before. So while it's a tax that would have probably worked in 1766, it's not going to work in 1773 because they're much more aware and concerned about British external taxation, and Britain has conceived a tax that's as visible and obvious to them as any internal tax would be.